In this section of our training series, we'll take a look at hazardous material awareness. Here's a look at some of our objectives. The first thing we need to focus on is helping you understand the role of the first responder. Then we need to make sure that you are competent in the following: hazardous substance recognition, their risks, possible outcomes if a release happens, and how to recognize the need for help. When dealing with a hazmat situation, or one that could include a weapon of mass destruction, it's important to understand the different agencies that might be involved. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Standards, the DOT, Department of Transportation, and the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Threats can come in many forms. They can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas, and they're able to cause harm whether they are corrosive, flammable, toxic, poisonous, explosive, reactive, and/or a carcinogen. Okay, let's take a closer look at what might be considered a hazmat incident or what could be considered a WMD incident. First off, hazmat examples. Chlorine. This chemical is a strong oxidizer and is corrosive to lung tissue. Gasoline. Obviously it is flammable, but it actually can be explosive under certain conditions. And sodium hydroxide, which is corrosive to both tissue and metals. Now let's look at a few WMD examples. Biological agents include things like anthrax and smallpox. Chemical agents would be nerve agents like cyanide, blister, and pesticides. And nuclear agents including plutonium, cesium, cobalt, and uranium. Scary stuff, and it can create some scary situations. So, what kinds of outcomes can be created by these hazards? The first is obvious: the potential for victims. Other potential outcomes include environmental destruction, damage and/or destroyed buildings, partial or complete infrastructure collapse, and hysteria. So whether or not we get to any or all of these outcomes is based on a number of key elements. The nature of the material, if there was a release of WMD, what was the location, the weather, geographic features of the area affected, the time of day that the event takes place, and the number of people involved. What are the key methods of recognizing a hazmat or WMD situation? First, look at the suspected container or containers. Consider the labels on it as well as its type and size. Then detect any odors that might be in the air, and as always, be aware of any signs of or symptoms on potential victims. Also, take note of any environmental damage that may have occurred. Another way of recognizing threats would be to use the monitoring equipment that you have available to you. When dealing with victims, there's a number of things you need to identify and understand, especially as it relates to weapons of mass destruction. These symptoms can all point to WMDs, including biological agents that people may have been exposed to. Tremors, blisters, coughing, and vomiting. Okay, how can you be sure you can identify all of the different containers you might come across? Or recognize all the labels that are relevant to this training? The DOT, Department of Transportation Guidebook, is your source for all of that information. This guidebook should become your best friend during these circumstances, and you must become familiar enough with it to quickly find the answers you need. The book is divided into 5 different sections, and it's color-coded so that you can find the section you need quicker. They are white, yellow, blue, orange, and green. What do these sections represent? The first is white. It's a general information section. Here you will find a table of placards. This is very useful when an ID number or name is not available. You will also have charts that will help you identify rail and road cars, and you will find a list of the hazard identification codes. These numbers provide you with a lot of important information. For instance, if you come across a number on a container that is a 2-digit number that is doubled, like 33, it indicates a greater hazard. Or if you have a number that is prefixed with an X, then the substance will react with water. Or if a 9 is in the second or third digit, then there is a risk of spontaneous violent reaction. The second is the yellow section, which allows you to identify a substance by its ID number. These numbers are on a list of 4-digit numbers that will immediately identify what substances you're dealing with, and will allow you to take that information to the green section of the book and look for your next move. The blue section shows you how to identify the substances by product name. These product names sometimes are located on the containers, so make sure you look closely at the suspected threat. The orange section has the emergency response guidelines and action guides for different products. It will list any safety information for a potential hazard and then list the correct response for that hazard. Finally, the green section tells you about the initial isolation techniques and the accurate action distances that you need to heed to be safe in certain situations. Simply put, it tells you how far back you need to get when you encounter potentially dangerous circumstances. Wow, that's a lot of information for one little book, but it's all information you need to be familiar with. There's a lot of symbols, ID numbers, and identifying markers for the hazards you'll face every day, but pay attention to them. They'll help keep you and the people around you safe. Some of those symbols include the DOT placard, various hazardous material markings, the NFPA label, the HMIS label, the skull and crossbones, which is a symbol for poison, and the radioactive icon. Let's look at a couple of visuals. What kinds of containers are you going to encounter? When talking about larger ones, you might find barrels. Some are plastic and some are metal. You will also come across smaller ones. Don't be fooled into thinking that every threat must come in a large package. Some will be as small as a prescription bottle. Then we get to the mobile containers, things like railroad cars. Understand that there are a variety of different cars being hauled on the railways, and they all have a specific purpose. The shape alone can give you a lot of information about what might be inside. This also goes for cargo tanks that are hauled across the highways by truck. Some of these cargo tanks are for low-pressure materials. Some carry toxic chemicals. If you come across a tanker that is rolled over on a highway, as a responder, you need to be able to assess the situation accurately. Speaking of a situation like that, let's stop and take a moment and reflect on your role as a first responder. Using your DOT guidebook, you should be able to assess any danger that could be lurking inside a potentially hazardous container. Beyond assessment, you should have a pre-emergency plan. You should understand your limitations in these circumstances. You need to take the proper steps to evacuate any people to the minimum safe distance your guidebook dictates to you. OSHA would have you contact the appropriate authorities and then take no further action, only monitoring the situation. However, the Office for Domestic Preparedness would also suggest that you attempt to minimize further contamination if possible. In certain situations, there may be a need to evacuate an area. When these situations occur, make sure you've thought through the process. Proper planning can be the difference between making a bad decision and knowing what the right one is. If the need arises, don't be afraid to organize an evacuation. First, find out if there is any predetermined shelter in place. If not, you'll need to find one. Set up assembly points along the way. Take constant head counts of the people that you are evacuating, and remember that communication is the key, both with the people you are assisting and any communication that you can do with either the authorities or with the command post. This brings us to a very important point, one that can get lost in the heat of the moment. Contact people. Call for more resources. Don't be afraid to ask for more help. This goes back to understanding your limitations. Make sure that you can recognize the need for help. If you find yourself in a situation, remember to notify the authorities. Try to maintain scene security as best as you can. Keep people out of any warm or hot zones. Protect any crime scene that might be involved, and always communicate with IC. There was a very important tidbit of information in there, one we haven't touched on yet. Keeping people out of the warm and hot zones. What are the zones? They are control areas that will help you determine the level of danger and where you can let people go. Hot zones. These border on immediately dangerous to health and life levels. Warm zones. These edge below the permissible exposure limits or the threshold limit values. Decon. This isn't really a zone, but rather the border between the warm and cold zones. Cold zones. These are non-exposure areas. Here is a possible layout of a scenario. Notice how the public is kept, not only safely out of the way, but also not downwind from the potentially harmful hazard. If possible, it is also suggested that the public be placed out of sight. One more thing. As important as staying ahead of a situation is, do not put yourself in harm's way to collect more information about the conditions. You should practice using the DOT guidebook. Here's a few examples. What substance is UN number 1202? How about 1823? What is the evacuation distance for Guide 111 and Guide 127? What are the UN number and guide number for potassium hydroxide solution? What is the first isolation distance for methyl mercaptan at night? Other things you should be familiar with include contact numbers and what agencies handle what situations. Ask questions about what resources and assets are available if needed. Competency training must include exercises relevant to your own response area using the DOT guidebook.